Thank you for your talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think you're looking at the future, the face of the future of philosophy of education, because we've been hearing it's getting less popular and maybe threatened. And I'm an empirical researcher here, I'm not a philosopher of education, but I find some value in susangati with philosophers of education. Yeah. In other words, I like trucking with them. I'm primarily an empirical researcher, and I have an interest in understanding learning, human understanding, and understanding the idea of education. I have a preference for qualitative methods as they allow greater scope for the meanings of ideas to emerge in specific contexts, rather than assume that concepts which are of value in education are well established, known, and translatable across cultures. This is essential as education and many of its core concepts which interest us today are far older than the institution of modern school or the scope of discussions of modern education, which takes place largely in the contexts created by nation states and public systems of education, and in the case of India, also our colonial history. Knowledge, teachers, pedagogy, teaching and learning, and various institutional arrangements for knowledge transmission are a part of human societies and cultures in general, and are also very old. Even ancient institutions being shaped and reshaped in different historical periods for different societal purposes. The primatologists Primark and Premark identified intergenerational transmission of culture as being what makes humans distinctively human, and used the term pedagogy to designate this. Rather than language and culture, they identified pedagogy as being what makes humans distinctive. Thus, the realization that pedagogy, an intentional, normative, intergenerational interaction, is a feature of all cultures, matters in the course of education research and education reform of present-day education systems, as very likely the current institutions and actors have evolved from or evolved in relation to and draw on older agents and institutional forms and practices. And these older institutional forms of practices may have acquired new layers of purpose, design, and form, but that does not mean by any means that the older ones are either displaced or that they cease to be of importance. Being an empirical researcher engaged with the study of primarily school education in India as a nation state, of a plural, diverse society and culture with a colonial past, and self-reflexively aware myself of being from the middle class, thinking and writing in English, and reading Western literature on education and schooling, one's methods not only need to be anthropological in the sense of investigating culture and translating across cultures, but also historical for obvious reasons, and philosophical, as this work requires constant conceptual clarification, delimitation, as well as vigilance as we carry concepts across philosophical systems. This method could be called a philosophical anthropology. And while I can't claim to have been trained in either philosophy or anthropology, this is the name that I give to the method that I use. I want to use this method and this paper to try to think through and try to answer a question which arose in the course of my study of children, childhood, and knowledge transmission of a central Indian forest tribe. The word tribe evokes an imagination of something exotic, different. I'm sure when the word tribe is uttered, what comes to your mind would be feathered headgear, drumming and dancing, perhaps isolation, lack of contact with civilization and the mainstream, perhaps superstitious ways, witchcraft, distinct cosmologies, theories of how the world came to be, perhaps also a life lived in an enchanted surrounding and an animated world with very close links with nature. Possibly these are the images that come prominently to mind. In the case of the Central Indian tribe that I studied, all these characteristics were true. However, firstly, this tribe was not isolated. They lived and moved with other tribals and non-tribals, mainly caste Hindus groups, with whom they engaged and related, not only in the market, but also through rituals and practices that bound these communities to each other within the locations in which they live. But more importantly, these are the characteristics that I have mentioned of enchantment, an enchanted life, living in a world which is full of animated objects, a distinctive material culture, music and dance, cosmologies, rituals, gods. Also, these aspects were not unique to the tribals alone. In other words, on all these counts of distinctiveness of tribal cultures, the non-tribal groups had equally distinctive cultures. By extension, I want to point out that it is not only the non-tribal groups of that region who had distinctive cultures. If we stop to think about it, probably every Hindu caste group also has this kind of distinctive culture. Right from the untouchable jatis to the priestly jatis, all have distinctive cultures in this sense. Nevertheless, it seemed as if the experience of going to school constituted a disruption in the case of one group, which is the Central Indian tribe, and less so in the case of the other group, which is the caste Hindu group. It seemed that the children of the caste Hindu groups, the plains people, were more amenable to being schooled, while in the case of the tribal child, it seemed to go against the grain. It seemed that this was on account of something which belonged in the cultural realm, and that it was a question of culture. In mainstream Indian education discourse, well, anthropological discourse more broadly, cultural distinctiveness of the tribal is an accepted basis of exception, of meriting a unique educational response from the state. The underlying assumption is that modern education can cause the tribal to be alienated from his or her tribal culture. Such a concern for alienation from one's culture on account of being schooled was a common trope and a common concern even during the colonial period, that is in the period of the colonial unreformed educational system, and it was a well-established criticism even during the British time itself. Colonialism was recognized as not only being a project, an economic and a political project, but equally a moral and a cultural project. Exclusion, absence and silence or lack of representation or misrepresentation, particularly denigration of Indian ways of life, organization of society, practices, beliefs, knowledge systems, were features not only of textbooks, but also of pedagogy and of institutional form. Needless to say, correcting these was one of the important thrusts of educationists, both as a part of the national movement and afterwards as a part of independent India. We have a continuous history of contestation and quarrel on these matters, no doubt. This is to be expected, given the fact that the Indian nation state is not homogeneous, but an experiment to imagine unity in pluralism and diversity in a situation of pluralism and diversity of language, religion, and culture. And it is also because the Constitution sets out the Indian state as a modern state which values scientific knowledge and the values of liberal democracy and which espouses a welfare and reformist agenda. In other words, the Indian state is also a political and a cultural epistemic and with a cultural, epistemic and moral agenda which is not necessarily in consonance with existing cultures. I do not want to give you the impression that cultures are static. On the contrary, all cultures are dynamic, alive, they change, they alter, but especially given that education is about formation of the young and the intergenerational transmission of culture, understood now in a very broad sense of beliefs, attitudes, values, the selection of these is bound to be of central interest to multiple stakeholders, and there are likely to be as many approaches possible to this as there are of the idea of India. Since independence, there have been at least three distinctive ways in which the question of culture has been approached in Indian curriculum. In the 1970s, and at least up to the National Curriculum Framework of 1988, and the period before the National Curriculum Framework of 1988, the idea of India was largely a nationalist Nehruvian idea of India. The attempt was to construct one history and the national movement as ridding both colonialism, the idea of university in diversity, and trying to forge an Indian identity through this idea or this idiom, this phrase, was the attempt of the Indian education system. Many aspects of culture were actually relegated to the private realm and at best emerged in the school space as forms of entertainment or leisure. Local was appropriated into science as something on which science could be applied in order to understand the local context. In other words, there was a centrality of the notion of science for progress. The frame of school was a relatively strong one, and the world of the child outside the school rarely found representation within the school. Not that the textbooks lacked culture. On the contrary, they were found to be biased towards the urban middle class lifestyle and also very gendered. So it's not that the problem of culture was solved, but this was by and large the approach that the National Curriculum Framework had to the question of culture. The NCF 2000 represented rude awakening for many Indians who had more or less accepted that this would be the manner in which the idea of India would be constructed, when an alternative notion of India began to feature in the textbooks. A nationalist Hindutva cultural approach to education began to feature in the education system. The idea of India was appropriated into the idea of Hindu, and Indian pride was asserted through remembering the past, especially Hindu culture of the past. Hindu culture itself moved out of the realm of the private to claim more space in the public, and culture was largely drawn out of religion. Perhaps the most ambitious experiment of cultural redefinition of this period was to alter the definitions of what would be called science and non-science through cultural arguments and make a claim that the subject of astrology should be included within the university as meriting state patronage. In the NCF 2005, we see a different approach to the idea of culture. The NCF 2005 broadly represents a liberal imagination, but it is different from the earlier liberal imagination of the period up to the 1988, because it recognizes more of local as a part of this liberal imagination. Culture becomes much more important now, and local knowledge, local belief systems at the community level begin to be discussed in the context of the National Curriculum Framework. The assumption in the National Curriculum Framework 2005 seems to be broadly that a progressive education approach where meaning making is given central importance will make the boundaries of the school more porous and allow for more of interaction between the manner in which knowledge is constructed in the school and the world of the child outside the school. Of course, in the face of criticisms, especially from the West, that this was opening up the school to many aspects of Indian culture which were undesirable in the modern state, such as superstitious beliefs, patriarchy, caste system, there was a corrective in the NCF 2005 saying that the filter would be the constitutional filter, which would more or less enable us to think about what in local cultures could become a part of the public discourse which is represented by the school. Many leftists were very dissatisfied with this approach of openness and inclusivity to the local context, and it was seen as placing unreasonable expectations from teachers. Now, if we trace the parallel approaches to the education of tribal system over the same periods that I have delineated broadly, we find that in the initial period, until the NCF 2000 at least, the approach broadly believed or valued the idea of distinctiveness and uniqueness of the tribal. Therefore, the argument that they merit special treatment in the form of ashram shalas or home-like residential schools located in remote areas, which would enable children to continue with their local practices and customs and forms of life, along with the acquisition of school knowledge. There was a more explicit recognition of the material aspects of tribal life in the sense of dress and customary practices. This was also a period which was marked by the attempt to develop primers in the tribal languages. The NCF 2000, however, regarded tribal communities as an extension of the Hindu society and emphasized this continuity in its cultural agenda. In the NCF 2005, there is no celebration or even explicit mention of the cultural uniqueness of the tribal. However, it seems to be suggested that the category local and the idea of local knowledge can accommodate the cultural distinctiveness of tribals, both in the sense of location of the child as an epistemic subject and also situated in the sense of being located within a culture. Now, by and large, all these approaches that I have described assume that the problem of culture, as it has been formulated in independent India, is a curriculum problem. Whether it is a matter of social identity and representation, knowledge or beliefs, it is to be addressed in the domain of curriculum through selection and inclusion. These negotiations are political. They involve the collective bargaining of collectives and groups. They're charged, they're contested, and eternally open to being revisited and revisioned. Complex as the problem is, nevertheless, it is contained in curriculum formulation and in textbook development. The suggestion is that it should be possible in principle, that one can go through schooling and be educated in a manner which locates one within one's culture and not to experience alienation in the sense of losing one's relationship with one's culture and experiencing that kind of an acultural anomie. This position is not contrary to the possibility that you may be schooled and you may have a critical relationship with your culture in the sense that you may not accept every aspect of your culture, you may want to change it, but nevertheless you would not be alienated from it. If the problem of culture for the Indian child in mainstream Indian school can be solved in the arena of curriculum, whereby beliefs and local knowledge are negotiated in the space of curriculum, and social identities of various levels of collectives are not denigrated in the public space, even if there may not be any special attempt to nurture or engage with these identities. Cannot this approach solve the problem of culture for the children of tribal communities? If we can recognize that our reaction when a tribal child ceases to wear loses her exotic appearance when she gives up her dupki and she adopts a school uniform is a little more than a sentimental nostalgia for a way of life, then would we believe that there is still a substantive cultural problem that remains with the education of tribal children in schools? Elsewhere, I have argued that the form and the structure of school, especially of curriculum, is largely linked to literate traditions. That is, the form and structure of the modern school institution basically is designed for literate traditions, and it is not compatible with the epistemic corpus of this particular tribe that I have studied, where I have argued that the epistemic traditions really come from a world where enchantment is very central, and when this kind of knowledge gets appropriated into a modern school curriculum, it is no longer able to contain the structure and form in which it functions within the epistemic tradition in which it is created. Here, in this particular paper, I want to argue that the problem of incommensurability between the two contexts is even deeper than a dissonance or a difference between epistemic traditions that particular knowledge corpus of specific cultural communities represent. I believe that there is a substantive problem which remains, which cannot be addressed in the space of curriculum. The nature of the problem represented by culture cannot be understood if it is articulated only in terms of what is transmitted intergenerationally without factoring in how it is done. In other words, it is not only the worldview, including the external aspects of material culture, codified knowledge, ritual practice, and the internal aspects of beliefs and concepts, but also the manner in which this transmission takes place, which distinguishes one culture from the other. And in this, I'm arguing that broadly, my investigation leads me to believe that there are at least two broad pedagogic cultures or learning cultures which we find within India, perhaps even three. Broadly, I have distinguished two types of learning cultures in the Indian context. The one I'm going to call the Guru culture, and the other I'm going to call the Susangati culture. What are Guru cultures? Guru cultures are teacher-oriented cultures. These are cultures that really transmit knowledge through the active work of teachers at teaching. In fact, these cultures can be identified with the centrality of the business of teaching, not only through the explicit identifiable persona of the guru, but even in the day-to-day practices in which children become socialized and grow up. In these cultures, autonomy is not very valued. It may be more or less valued. But there is little debate about the validity of the person being in a position of authority on account of culture, on account of knowledge. Normative standards begin to be applied on every aspect of human life. There's a great deal of awareness and expectation of levels, standards to be achieved, what should happen at which part of human's life. There is a range of learning styles which are possible, from rote to critical thinking, but all of them happen within this broad notion that children will learn by being taught. In other words, the centrality of the teacher. The Susangati culture, on the other hand, is a culture of learning in the company of knowledgeable others. In other words, this is not a culture which does not recognize the centrality of knowledge, or that there may be people who are more knowledgeable than others, but on account of being more knowledgeable, you are not given a privileged space in society. You may be recognized as knowledgeable, and therefore a child will want to associate with you in order to learn from you, but being knowledgeable does not give you special privileges in this culture. And being knowledgeable does not mean that you have to teach. In the Guru cultures, being knowledgeable renders the person with an anxiety to teach. In fact, if you don't teach, you feel you can't exist, or the culture will die out, or the insight that you have gained will be lost unless you are able to communicate it to somebody else. So Guru cultures tend to be accumulative in their knowledge traditions, and they also have an anxiety that the knowledge corpus has to be transmitted through the work of gurus. And gurus means you must have students, and these will be related to each other in structures of authority. The Susangati culture recognizes that there may be knowledgeable people, but the method of learning is by association. So when you want to learn, you will seek out the company of a knowledgeable person and learn in their company. It's not that you will be taught. In the Guru culture, these are associated with textual and literary traditions. What is known can be objectified, it can accumulate, and it is the job of the Guru to transmit this and to also enhance what he or she knows. The known is also reified, and it can exert authority in epistemic exchanges and contribute to the orientational stance of the epistemic subject. There is an emphasis on the young as being in a state of becoming, and the learner state dominates the life of the young. In contrast, the Susangati cultures, very similar to the idea of the oral culture, what is known is more flexible, and it can alter constantly in every retelling. This is natural, and it is recognized as such. That is, there is an explicit awareness that this can be the nature of knowledge, because knowledge is batkaha, that which is spoken on and told. And naturally, in the act of speaking and telling, knowledge will change. Much of this knowledge is located in contexts of practice. Knowledgeable people may be recognized through their reputation, and their achievements may be available for others to recognize. But the key in the culture of Susangati is that knowledge does not accord you distinction and privilege, even when your expertise is recognized. So on certain occasions, I have seen that simply because somebody is better at something, it doesn't mean that in a particular social context, they will somehow acquire privileged. So you can, in a gathering, have an extremely badly playing cicada player and an extremely mellifluous cicada player playing together with complete authority over the situation. In a performance of dance, you may have an exquisitely performing dancer with an absolutely clumsy dancer, both performing without any special privileges being acquired in these acts where knowledge gets performed or where you are performing as a bearer of specialized knowledge. The emphasis on the young is on being, and one can take the learner stance whenever one chooses. It's not that you won't take the learner stance, but it's up to you. While in the guru culture, there's a tendency to visit the learner identity on specific individuals by structures of authority, epistemic authority which exist in society. In the course of my trying to understand these pedagogic cultures or learning cultures, I came across the work of Frederick Barth, and there he has identified through his work in Southeast Asia and Melanesia two cultures. The one is the guru culture which I was speaking about, and a lot of the characterization that I found, which I kind of drew from the Indian mainstream society, is something which Barth explicates and describes with even more fine detail. He draws attention to a third kind of learning culture which is possible, which he calls the initiation culture. Here, the knowledgeable person is very secretive about what he or she knows. And the object of the knowledgeable person is not to teach. In fact, it is often not to reveal. And you will find knowledgeable people in these cultures being very secretive about what they know and not at all anxious to pass it on to anybody else. And in fact, the learner in these cultures will extract knowledge from such knowledgeable people through any means, including trickery and getting the teacher drunk. So there is a very different method by which knowledge may be transmitted in that society. But key in it, which I feel is distinctive, is that there is no urge to teach, even though there may be the urge to learn. So broadly, my argument is that cultures need to be distinguished broadly on these lines. Cultures which are teaching oriented and cultures which are not. Both cultures have, both forms of culture or pedagogic structures in both these cultures will have the aspect of learning or wanting to learn. But the centrality of the guru in one cultural form makes it very different in how it is organized for knowledge transmission as compared to the other. And I believe that this is not only central for specialized knowledge of the intellectual kind, but this is a basic organizing principle that pervades the culture right from the formalized institutions where teaching learning takes place to the more informal settings in which children are socialized within the space of home. The guru cultures are those which are hierarchically organized. They are more centered around the pedagogic authority of a teacher or a principle of knowledge, whether through caste hierarchy or the hierarchy of merit and the possession of knowledge and the consequences of merit. People are located and oriented towards each other. Although there may be autonomy and individualism that is supported in such a culture, these autonomies are networked through epistemic power principles, and learning the culture is possible through socialization into such epistemic power interrelationships. The Susangati social order is, on the other hand, individualized without such epistemic interdependencies, even as it concerns children. Learning in this culture involves a different form of being and becoming and relating to others. I want to end with the conclusion that I want to make of why, therefore, the institution of modern school seems to be commensurable with mainstream Indian schooling, while in the case of tribal children, it seems to constitute a deep threat. The culture of school is commensurable with the form of a guru culture. And therefore, it was possible for schools to become a part of mainstream Hindu society, even though there weren't cultural consonance between the British system and the Indian system. Nevertheless, there was a deep commensurability between the pedagogic principles on which the two societies are organized. In other words, the mainstream Hindu culture, being a guru culture, is pedagogically commensurable with the modern Western school and perhaps also with modernity. However, tribal cultures, and especially the tribe that I have studied, is a culture of learning, of susangati, and school in such a culture will either fail, and if it succeeds, it will be at the cost of this culture. Thank you.
More hands, we have microphones on phone.
To the notions of modernity which has been debated upon through the discourses of mistaken modernity or the idea of westernization and other issues. Let's take an idea that the modern school curriculum considers education as a citizen-making enterprise for a modern nation state, which believes that equality and liberty, and of course these equality and liberty are coming out of the French Revolution rather than coming from the idea of liberty, wish to make tribals feel as the part of the mainstream or as the part of the nation, and don't want to relegate them to feel as a second-class citizen. And going into that argument which Kancha Ilahia also puts further, that let us have access to the resources and then we will debate that which culture is to be saved and which is not to be saved. And the second question which I wanted to, I'll just put it, the privilege idea which comes with the notion of knowledge, that someone knowledgeable does feel privileged is because in our modern society the distribution of resources is depending upon the idea of meritocracy. So if someone gets more hold on resources because being more knowledgeable, of course that person will have the idea of the privilege. And is that privilege not also, and so getting more access to the resources should not be shared with these marginalized as quote unquote people? Thank you.
Much to comment on the idea of modernity, and in fact I just invoked it in passing, with the possibility that I might explore the implications of this argument vis-a-vis that concept, so I'm not going to get into it. I think the dimension of access to resources as a form of the privileges that accrue to you when you are knowledgeable is one aspect of it, but I think there's also a certain epistemic privilege which is not dependent on access to resources, but just the notion of I know and I speak from a position of knowledge, I think can be recognized in discourse itself. So speaking from knowledge is a certain epistemic stance, and it's certain, you privilege yourself because you think you know, and you also expect that others will recognize that you know. So a lot of discourse is structured on recognizing the knowledgeableness of others, and therefore being willing to listen to others, or expecting that I will be heard because I'm speaking from knowledge, which I think are epistemic stances, not only about access to resources.
I've lost track of where.
Professor Padma, I gather from what you said that the community that you studied was a pre-literate community and not a literate one. And secondly, you talked of culture. Culture in the sense that culture as a way of life is one meaning, but then again you talked about culture in teaching, cultures of teaching, like you said, the guru culture and the susangati culture. So I would like a little clarification of that. Besides, you also said what parts of local culture can be included in public discourse in the Indian context where the norm is heterogeneous, classrooms. So it is not likely that you will find large groups of a particular community, say a pre-literate community or tribal community, in one classroom. Okay? And though of course there are some like mother tongue education by the government of India in the state of Orissa and Andhra Pradesh, but other than that, how do you think that we can tackle that problem? Thank you.
You're right, but I would prefer the term oral rather than pre-literate, because I don't want to place them in some kind of a progression towards literacy. Earlier I was really thinking of these two contexts as the consequences of literate cultures and what happens within literate cultures as a consequence of literacy versus oral cultures. Now many people argue that actually Hindu society is not literate. I mean, that the oral tradition is so strong. But in a very deep way, it is a form of literate culture because it's a textual culture, and it has succeeded in objectifying words. It is not structured the way in which oral cultures are, which which also transmit knowledge through oral repetition, but the nature and the form of knowledge is much more fluid. So Indian mainstream culture is actually a textual culture and very similar to literate cultures. From that point of view, there's a reification of knowledge and an objectification of knowledge and the possibility of accumulation and reference and so on and so forth, which the mainstream Indian culture makes possible. Now,
Where's the microphone now?
the argument that I'm trying to make is that it is insufficient to think of culture only as a way of life. It is also a mode in which the knowledge is transmitted, which is integral to that culture. It's not only a way of life. If you make it only a way of life, it's like there's a content. And content belongs to curriculum. Content can translate into the institution of school. Yeah? The argument I'm trying to make that you cannot understand culture as only the content. You also have to understand explicitly the principles on which knowledge is transmitted.
Thank you very much for the talk, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is regarding the learning cultures. I can think of two more cultures which I think they exist. One is the Muslim madrasa culture, and the second one is the present internet culture where everything is available and you can just go and seek knowledge. So, I mean, can you just please comment on those two?
The madrasa culture is a guru culture.
Okay.
Completely. You will be dead if you don't keep teaching. There's a deep urge in that culture to teach all the time. Yeah. So it's a guru culture basically. In fact, Frederick Barth studied the guru culture in the context of Hindu Bali, looking at a Muslim preacher, over which he actually constructed the idea in that context. About the data culture, I think it broadly falls within the guru culture because there is a principle of knowledge ordering. But I think that at least there is an objectified knowledge reference point possibly. So even though the teacher is not there in a person, there is a building up of a knowledge corpus which exists in this digitized form. So my sense would be that it would still be by and large a guru-like culture, but I have to think the case through
I mean,
more
my
carefully.
point is it's not one-to-one, it's many-to-one.
It doesn't have to be one-to-one or many-to. I mean, that's not the point of it per se. Yeah. Even in the Susangati culture, it's not that it's a many-to-one organization, it's one-to-one, but it's just that how that one-to-one happened, when it happened, what were the standards, those are the points which are very different.
I have a question here.
Between guru cultures and Susangati cultures, because it seemed to me that actual guru cultures in, say, ancient India contained an element of Susangati. There was this notion of finding one's guru, somebody who was suitable for you, etc. At least in the darshan tradition and so forth. So I'm not sure that it's a real dichotomy. I do know that you mentioned a third possibility and so forth, but I just wanted to be sure that I understood the basic distinction.
I think actually the darshan is tending more towards a third form of the initiator. It's a teacher as an initiator there. And of course, it's not that the tribal communities are outside of the mainstream, and many of like Tantrism and so on, there's a lot of overlap as well. Yeah. So but I'm just using these as ideal types to some extent to try to distinguish broad pedagogic modes which exist within cultures.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
We had a question here, and then some. So first the gentleman, then the lady, then the gentleman here.
I understand is British sanction learning took place in the what is Susangati culture. The main society, so to some in the kind of material culture based on that. So I think you may have to look in from the mathematics. It one became state religion, caste, then probably several categories of one aspect. And according to me, there is no mainstream modern mainstream education tradition in the Indian context at present. Thank you.
I want to argue that broadly Hindu caste society is organized in the Guru mold. I mean, I want to build the argument to make that claim more forcefully. And and with regards the practices within occupations in the caste structure in which knowledge was transmitted, especially occupational knowledge, I believe that they are much closer to the kinds of occupational learning which, for example, have been studied by John Love and others. But there is an explicit recognition of the expert, privileges which accrue to the expert, period of apprenticeship, recognition of noviceship, which are like learning states, which are recognized, and they organize the manner in which the apprenticeship rolls out. Some of the observations that Chris was making about apprenticeship structures, there are clearly ways in which even apprenticeship structures operate with a very clear notion of who is the novice, who is the expert, and organizes the apprenticeship recognizing these differences. You have more privileges if you're an expert, you have fewer privileges if you're a novice. You may be a legitimate peripheral participant, but that's what you are. In the tribal context, the occupational learning is not organized like this, even by the younger concerned. Yeah, it is really a way of learning the occupations through susangati. So even if you know that the other person knows and you don't know, you're not placed in a hierarchical relationship on account of that. But you learn in their presence, and you learn through a lot of your own practice. The point is that the Guru cultures are structured around hierarchical relationships while these are not. Please don't take this to mean that I value therefore the non-hierarchical structure system. I'm not making that argument at all. I'm not saying that this is better than that. I'm just saying that these are organized in two very different ways, and they achieve their ends through very different modes of pedagogic functioning. That's the point I want to make.
We have a question from the lady here, then the gentleman here, then the gentleman over there. So,
I just wanted to point out that the so-called
this lady here first, gentleman here, then you.
Okay.
I'm quite fascinated by your idea of some knowledgeable others, and I'm working on collaborative learning and just wanted to add that this knowledgeable other can add students also, because students also they are capable of generating knowledge. And even NCF 2005 has talked a lot about community knowledge and community learning. But at the same time, I was also wondering about what sort of spaces we can provide within the constraints of time and heavy curricular load and our targets of achieving success standards. So I was just wondering about that. Thank you.
I don't want to devastate you, but my basic argument is that this can never be recreated in the school in the way it functions in tribal communities at least. So what we will achieve in the school will be within the institutional possibilities that the school allows. And I don't think we can really think that this pedagogic form can be recreated in the site of the school.
I have so many problems with your analysis. If you are only analyzing the fact, I have no quarrel. But if you are going to advocate it for the future of India, I have several things to quarrel about. If you are going to say Guru culture and Susangati culture are there to exist, I reject them altogether. Let me ask a simple question. Do we have a human culture in India? The answer is no. We have exploitative culture, we have divisive culture, we have no self-critical culture analysis at all in this country. So we need that. So if possible, the third culture, if we can create, that's more important for us. How do we do that? Unless we demolish many of assumptions, practices, in humanities in this country, in this culture, you call it mainstream, whatever, I don't care. We cannot do that. So what I would say is, we need a totally new, rational, humanistic culture, demolishing many of the assumptions we have in this country. Otherwise, we cannot reach anywhere. So I call it for a total cultural revolution we need in this country. We have to create it by ourselves. But I don't know how many in this hall will be ready to do. Thank you.
My point, we create this culture through teaching. That's the point I'm trying to make, that certain cultures are structured around the anxiety to teach and to transmit, while others are not. And that's all the point I'm making. I'm not even advocating these methods for the future.
You related the spread of education to this tribal society, which is largely, I would call it a non-literate society or an oral society, to the effort of Hindutva elements to come through the ashram paddhati schools and others, which I think I gather from the presentation has not been very successful. It has not really caught on in these tribal areas. But there is also another tradition, much older, which the Christian missionaries introduced in many tribal societies. They prepared primers in the local languages so that the Bible could be brought to them, and that became the starting point for a strong educational structure which has flourished in these tribal societies for a long time. And I don't know whether this has created any tension there or not. So do you see necessarily as the effort at introducing ashram paddhati schools or modern schools as creating a tension because of the different pedagogical traditions? And why has it not happened, or we don't see it, in those tribal societies where the Christian missionaries had been working for decades?
That I want to discuss is at all on the lines that you are formulating. You are actually formulating a new problem, in a way. I don't think that the Christian missionaries, following my typology, they are still guru cultures, the Christian missionaries, and I don't think that the cultural continuity in those areas is actually visible or apparent. People have changed. They have become a part of the mainstream, but that doesn't mean that their forms of ways of life no longer exist or continue. They have been transformed in the process. And I think that's what we have to face. That if we take modern schools into these areas, we will completely alter that way of life. We will not be able to find a solution within the institution of modern school which will be commensurable with that way of life, neither in content or in form.
We have a question from Jen.
How did this guru culture come about? The dynamics of that could be an interesting issue. I'm just stopping by saying that probably if you had studied a middle caste group, you could have gained some insights on the dynamics of that.
Of the man, yeah. No, it was just an observation. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question is linked to, this free and democratic schools movement, which represented by Summerhill in the UK and by Sudbury Valley School and its relatives in the US and in other places, sounded to me like coming under the typology of the Susangati mode. So I just was wondering, because here you don't have the anxiety to teach. was in the sense that children don't necessarily have to go through a curriculum that teachers insist that they learn. So I was just wondering if you have something to say about that.
I don't know these institutions, so I won't be able to comment on them.
Okay. I wanted to return to your mentioning of incommensurability in the beginning of your presentation. Also now you reaffirmed this. There's an idea in Hegel that essential to his notion of education is actually, or to his notion of Bildung more precisely, is a moment of alienation, where alienation is constitutive of any sort of educative process. It means that I'm confronted with something that is different than the status quo that I'm currently in, and then I'm alienated from that, but this means a process of evolvement. This means an educative process. Essential to that process is that from the state of alienation, I eventually return to some sort of integrated self that is on a higher level, or that is a richer self than what I started out from, in some sense. Now, I was trying to relate your talk about alienation. It seemed to stop with alienation as a very negative experience. So I just wanted to ask if you see any way that an exposure to a different sort of learning culture, does it necessarily end in a detrimental effect, or is there possibility of this exposure having a sort of educational process that then could lead to people also still integrating that with the local culture? But what I take your argument to be is that this is not possible.
I think in anxiety about culture in the Indian education system, there's actually very limited attempt to grapple with what it constitutes and what it is about it that we want. I think it's linked to the idea of culture itself, which is so difficult to even grasp or identify or locate. I think what you're speaking about of alienation as a negative experience, broadly in the Indian discourse, it has been seen as a very negative experience, the experience of alienation, which really means you feel you cannot return.
Okay.
That's really the experience of...
One sentence question. Do you think that every literate culture, just by sheer being a literate culture, leads to reification of knowledge?
I would think that...
Because this is how I understood a lot of your arguments, and the way that you open up the
reification of knowledge, but there is an accumulation of knowledge which is central to those literate cultures, and that's, I think, a feature of literacy. It's what literacy makes possible also. So that I would say yes, but whether it results in reification, I have not thought it through, so I wouldn't be able to say.
Thank you.
Before we thank our speaker, could I ask you to stay back for another 5 or 6 minutes? We have a few little business matters to attend to. But this concept of culture is clearly one that anthropologists of education and anthropologists, even some social psychologists deal with. But it's very, very important that philosophers of education start looking at this. It's a really central explanatory concept that's used in our field. And just the number of questions we had and the interest that we had from the talk shows that the interest extends here to India. So let's hope there's some wonderful journal articles coming in the near future, because there's certainly not enough written at the moment by philosophy of education. One last comment.
Education.
Right.
Very good book.
Right, and they're not all, but it's clearly a concept that requires the attention of analytic philosophy of education. So let's thank our speaker very much for a wonderful session. And before I hand the microphone over to our hosts, since I'm alone up here at the moment, I wanted to take a moment on behalf of all of us to thank the wonderful people who have hosted us so gracefully in the last few days. Varad, Prakash, Rohit and their colleagues have been wonderful, and so thank you guys very much indeed. And I take this as an example of empirical research that refutes Robin Barrow. I think you can take it that we're very, very appreciative and it was a very successful conference. So thank you very much.